Hey everyone, thank you all for joining us. I'm David Crisante and I'm the Acting Foundation Co-Director here at NeuRa. We're very grateful for your interest in today's discussion about mental health, resilience and well-being. I'm really keen to hear from our speakers. I'm sure I'm not alone in saying the last 6 months with the COVID pandemic has been pretty tough for me and many people in my life. So I'm personally quite excited to learn more about what we can do to be more mentally resilient. We're joined by some special guests today. We'll be hearing from Dr. Justine Gatt, one of Australia's leading scientists. Justine is a pioneer on resilience and well-being, and she'll start by explaining what these two terms mean. We're joined by another scientist, Miranda Chilver, who will give us a bit of information about her brand new research. And Braden French is also joining us. Braden is supporting our research by fundraising through NeuRa's campaign called Colour Your Hair for Mental Health. And he'll be speaking about his own experience with mental illness. So just a bit of housekeeping about today's webinar. You're about to hear from Justine, followed by Miranda and then Braden. After this, we'll have a question and answer session. And I really encourage you to send your answers through. You should see a little question answer button on your browser. These questions will come through to me and I'll do my best to get to as many as I can during the Q&A. So let's begin by hearing from Dr. Justine Gatt. We're all very excited to hear from you, Justine. And she's just getting her presentation on the screen now. So over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks for the introduction, David. And good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, what I'm going to be talking to you about is well-being and resilience and what they actually are, how they can be measured, and some of the neuroscience behind well-being and resilience. And then we're going to share some tips that you can use in your own life to hopefully promote resilience. So to begin with, let's just first cover mental health in the general population. So anxiety and depression, as we know, are the most common mental health disorders in the general population. Up to 29% of the population suffer from anxiety or mood disorders at least once in their lifetime. So it's very common. Prevalence rates start to rise, particularly during late adolescence, with up to 7% of 11 and 15-year-olds and 20% of 16 to 17-year-olds reporting clinical symptoms, which peak in early adulthood. So that's when you see the symptoms starting to emanate. Now, if we happen to look at this mental health continuum, we can understand how well-being sits in terms of mental illness. So as we know, we have quarter of the population that have some sort of mental health disorder. And then we have the rest of the population what are considered healthy. But actually, if you look at their levels of well-being, the variation is quite considerate. And only about 20% of the population have high well-being, so what we consider flourishing. So what does that actually mean? What is well-being? Now, there are two key constructs that comprise well-being. The first is what we usually hear about, and that's subjective well-being. So that's how satisfied you are with your life, your quality of life, or your level of happiness. Now, the other key construct that's sometimes not always reported is psychological well-being. So this is things such as your life purpose, your autonomy, mastery, self-acceptance, self-worth, those kind of things. So when you measure both of these constructs, you get a composite measure of mental well-being. Now, what about resilience? How does that fit in the picture? So we've got this graph again here, and essentially resilience is when you are given some sort of stressful life experience to deal with, or adversity or trauma. Resilience is your adaptability to that stressor. So how you can adapt to it and then reach back to your optimal level of well-being to where you were before the event happened. So resilience is not just a coping strategy, it's actually a process of adaptive recovery following adversity. So it can include quite a few things. So it includes your genetics, your environment, your personality, so how tenacious you are, your levels of optimism, the coping styles that you use to actually deal with stress, your social support networks, but also your access to resources, so how much community support you have, financial support, spiritual support. And it all really depends on the type of adversity you're actually dealing with at that point in time. So why is resilience so important right now? I probably don't need to explain all of the possible reasons why resilience is important right now, particularly during COVID, which everyone is currently experiencing. But I guess if you think back to 20, 30 years ago when we didn't really have internet, now that it's introduced, we've got our lives, which are a lot more time pressured, they're a lot faster, we have a lot more work demands to achieve. So there's a lot of things that we need to actually deal with on a daily basis. And the other thing is we're not actually taught how to effectively deal with stress or to promote our own well-being. If you think back to school, you probably weren't, well, I know I wasn't really informed of how to actually deal with stress in an adaptive manner, how to actually promote my own well-being. And so it's a really crucial thing that everyone needs to be aware of and to learn at any point in their life. So I guess the aim of our research program is to identify the neuroscience of wellbeing and resilience so that we understand what defines people who are flourishing from those who are languishing. And that will just help inform future health promotion strategies. So we can target people who might be a bit more vulnerable to promote their well-being down the track. And so our research program is quite broad. It covers basic science to clinical intervention. And so I'm just going to touch on a few aspects of that program right now. Now, one of the largest studies that we are currently running is the Twin study, which is an adult twin study. And this is something we started about 10 years ago, and we looked at 1,600 healthy adult twins across Australia. And they included both identical twins and non-identical twins. So these aren't the actual pictures of any of our twins, but these are some real brain images that we have from them. And as you can see with the identical twins, you can not really identify the differences, even in their brain structure. But if you're looking at the non-identical twins, there's obvious differences in their brain structure. And I guess non-identical twins are just as similar as any normal sibling pair. So the reason that we are looking at twins in this particular study is because we can look at the differences in their genetics versus their environment. So we know with identical twins, they're 100% genetically identical, whereas non-identical twins are 50% genetically identical, whereas both pairs of twins share a common environment. So using those differences, we can actually compare twins and to see what drives different relationships in terms of genetics versus environment. And so in these particular twins, we got them to complete quite a few questionnaires. They did some cognitive tests. They provided their saliva so we can look at their DNA. And then some twins came into our lab and they did some MRI and some EEG brain testing. So I'm just going to go through some of the results from that study at the moment. One of the key outcomes that that came out of that study is the development of this wellbeing scale called the Compass W. And the reason that we developed this scale was so that we could measure both subjective and psychological well-being, as I mentioned in the beginning. And so you can get a total score on well-being, but you can also get these 6 sub-dimensions on well-being. And I'm just going to show you some example items right now so you can see and get a feel for what we are actually measuring. So as you can see, we've got these 6 dimensions down the side here. So we've got composure during stress, your own worth, which looks at, I guess, your self-worth. mastery, so that's how much control you feel you have over your environment, your level of positivity or optimism. Achievement is about goal striving, and satisfaction with life is how satisfied you feel with your life overall, but also your relationships, your work environment, and those kind of things. And so these are some example items from some of those subscales. And I guess if you had a read with some of these, if you answered yes to most of them, or towards the agree side of the scale, then that means you probably have higher well-being than if you answered no to all of them. So what determines well-being? I guess this is kind of the core of all of our work. We want to know, is it genetics? Do we have certain genes that promote it? Is it our certain life experiences? Is it our mood on the day? Is it how we regulate our emotions when we're stressed? Is it our physical health factors, so our sleep, diet, exercise? Or is it how our brain processes information and how we cognitively process information, like memory, attention, and those kind of things? So I'm going to go through each of these very briefly and show some results, either from other work or from our work, to just show how well-being is related to each of these. To begin with, genetics versus environment. Now, because we had a twin study, we were able to look at the genetics of our well-being scale. And what we found was that total well-being is 48% heritable. So that means 48% of our total well-being is due to our genetics, which means the other half is due to our environment. So it's almost a 50-50 relationship. So what we do, what the types of life experiences is just as important as some of the, I guess, heritable factors that you inherit from your family. And then if we look at the dimensions, sub-dimensions of well-being, the genetic contribution varies a bit with them. So in terms of how you deal with stress, it's less genetic versus other things such as how satisfied you are with your life or your levels of positivity, which is slightly more genetic. And how does this compare to other mental health disorders? So in other studies, they have reported that well-being, generally speaking, it ranges from 25 to 50% in terms of heritability, so that's genetic contribution, which is similar to levels of anxiety disorders and depression, whereas these other disorders are a lot more genetic. So ADHD, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder have a higher genetic predisposition, and they have a less influence from environment. Now, in terms of environment, what are these are some, I guess, stressful life experiences that we can all experience, and that would actually be associated with lower well-being. So the first and probably the worst type of trauma is childhood trauma, and this impacts actually 1 in 5 people, and that can range anywhere from neglect, abuse, family conflict, to bullying in school, hospitalization due to some sort of personal health issue, death of loved ones, and so forth. And then we have similar traumas that can occur in adulthood, and in this case, it's 1 in 2 people experience these sort of things. Again, they can be assault, natural disasters, warfare, injuries, car accidents, and those kind of things. And then the other one that we have is daily hassle. So this is not, this impacts everyone. So it's not, how many people it's impacted, it's how frequent it actually impacts you. And essentially, they have suggested that there's one event that we experience for half of any given week. So we experience one of these at least half of any given week. So we can have relationship conflicts, work demands, financial stress, arguments, traffic fines, and the list goes on. So there's quite a bit that we all need to deal with, I guess, in everyday life, and more often than not, it's uncontrollable. But it's important to realize that the effects of stress are not all bad. We actually need a certain level of stress to reach our peak performance. And the amount of stress that you need, it varies. So each person needs a certain amount. And without it, they won't be able to be focused. So you can probably imagine if you've got a task that you need to do, if you have a bit of time pressure, it makes you motivated to really get it done and completed. Whereas if you didn't have that, you would feel really bored probably with the task. It's not very challenging. But then if you go on the other side of the scale, too much pressure and I guess burden of that particular stressor can lead to burnout and breakdown. So this is what we call a bell curve. And in some studies, what they've actually found is a stress inoculation effect. So what that means is that if you have experienced mild controllable stresses throughout your life, it is actually associated with higher resilience. And the reason is because you learn through those experiences and coping with those experiences. If you are effectively able to cope with that stress, you then learn for future stresses how to cope with it effectively. So it's kind of like a stress inoculation effect, which promotes resilience. Now, moving on to some protective environmental factors. These are, I guess, good things that we can experience that promotes high well-being. One thing is enriched and stimulating environments, particularly during childhood. Positive and secure relationships with our caregivers. In particular, we need just at least a positive and secure relationship with at least one caregiver to be associated with higher well-being and better mental health. But this also includes social support from teachers, peers, strong community values, and so forth. The other key protective factor is to have a positive support at major life transition points. So these are things such as when you're moving away from home, you're changing jobs, you have a new baby, you're going from, you're getting married, or you're going through a divorce or separation. If you have the support from at least one person, so it's whether your partner or a friend, through those kind of major transition points, that is seen to be a protective factor towards higher well-being. Okay, so now we're going to move on to mood and physical health factors. So in our work, what we actually did was we looked at those who had high well-being versus low well-being, so flourishing versus languishing. And what we actually found was those who were flourishing had lower anxiety, depression symptoms. They had more emotional reappraisal. So they're reappraising the event when they're stressful into something that's less stressful. And they also showed all these typical physical health behaviors that you would expect with someone who is considered healthy. So they had a good diet, they had a decent night's sleep, 6 to 8 hours, and they exercised regularly. And they also showed low work absenteeism, so they were less likely to be absent from work. And then for those who were languishing on the opposite end of the spectrum, and mind you, these are all healthy people, not no one had any sort of diagnosed mental health disorder. They showed the opposite. So they had higher anxiety, depression, they had more emotional suppression, so they suppress their emotions when they're stressed, and they had all the poorer physical health indicators, so poor diet, not much sleep, probably no exercise, and low work productivity. So that means they went to work, but when they were at work, they weren't productive. So different to absenteeism. Now, moving on to the cognitive brain mechanisms. We've done a few studies in our twins looking at how well-being links to different cognitive functions. And basically what we found was those who had higher well-being had increased attentional capacity, so they were able to be more flexible in their attention as well as sustaining it. They were able to process positive emotions a lot faster than a neutral base emotion. So that suggests that they had, I guess, a bias towards processing happier emotions in people. And finally, amongst other things, we found with the resting brain state, so in this case, we looked at the EEG patterns across the brain. So people are fitted with these caps, and we look at electrical activity across the brain. It's all completely non-invasive. And what we found was this profile, what we think refers to as a calmer brain resting state. So across all these red regions on the brain is where the individuals who had higher well-being showed this pattern of EEG activity, which is associated with lower anxiety and just lower, I guess, general arousal. So suggesting those who had higher well-being had this calmer state. Okay, so now towards the end of my talk, I'm going to talk a bit more about how you can actually promote increased well-being in yourself. Now with the compass scale, we've got this framework where we are able to promote tips that, I guess, target each of these well-being subdimensions. And if you're interested in this particular slide, I think there's a copy of it on my website, but I also think the NeuRa team might email this around, or a copy of this. But I'm just going to go through some examples of each of these so that you can apply them in your own life. Now, the first one is composure during stress. So this is how you actually deal with stress. So what I want you to do is think about, the last time you were stressed, how did you actually deal with it? Did you use more adaptive coping styles, or did you use more maladaptive ones? And before you actually implement those coping styles, what I want you to do is actually become more aware of your body when you're starting to become stressed. Because when you're starting to become stressed, the first signs of stress are physical symptoms. So your hands start to sweat, your heart starts to race, you start to get really irritable with people or tense. They're your first signs. And if you can actually capture and be a bit more self-aware of when those signs are starting to come on, you then create an opportunity where you can think, okay, how am I going to deal with it in this situation? Am I going to try something new? And what you can do is therefore try an adaptive coping style if you don't use them already. So for instance, if you normally get quite angry, or you start venting to other people when you're stressed out, what you can try and do is use more tension relieving coping styles. So you can use humor, you can use yoga, those kind of things. If you're the type of person who would, pull out a cigarette or take a drink when you're really stressed, you can try and use exercise instead. And if you're the type of person who just wants to avoid the problem altogether or pretend it's not even happening, an alternative way is to actually use active problem solving. So you take the problem head on and you think rationally, okay, how are we going to deal with this in the most effective manner? So this is just a way, I guess, of just being a bit more mindful of how you deal with stress, and see if you can try a new activity. Now, the next one is own worth. Now, this is all about, I guess, your self-worth. It's about knowing who you are, what your values are, what you stand for, and what you consider right from wrong. And then it's preserving your self-worth with healthy boundaries when you're dealing with other people. So for instance, if someone is kind of stepping in on your boundaries, it's knowing how to standing up for what you believe in, it's learning how to say no to someone without feeling like you need to give a reason. And I guess the most effective way of doing this is by using assertiveness. So if you Google assertiveness techniques, you can learn a bit more about how to be assertive, which is a lot better option than if you use, for instance, aggression or passive aggression, which are the other ways you can, I guess, try and assert yourself, but it's not as effective. So a healthy way is to use assertiveness. And I guess a question that you might want to ask yourself is, do you preserve your self-worth? So when you are in a situation where you feel like someone is encroaching on your boundaries, do you actually preserve them? And if not, why not? And that's a pretty big question that I'm asking you right now, and many people find it quite challenging issue to confront. And usually it emanates from someone or some past experience making you feel that you're unworthy. But if you can find the answer to that question and then find ways to actually challenge those false self-beliefs, then you have found one big key to improving your well-being right from the core. Now, another thing that you could do is this technique called self-compassion. Now, this is something that Miranda, the speaker following me, she's going to elaborate on. So Miranda's a PhD student from our team. And this particular technique is really useful when things just don't go to plan. So in those situations, often when, things don't work out, we usually sometimes, well, some of us are our worst enemy. We really beat ourselves up for thinking, oh, why did I do that? Why did I do it this way? Rather than being our #1 supporter. So self-compassion is a really great technique for promoting that. And Miranda will talk a bit more about that. Okay, the third one is mastery. So mastery is all about your level of self-confidence. It's how much control you feel you have over your environment. It's how much control you feel you have over your life. And I guess the biggest hindrance to mastery is fear. It's fear of the unknown, and it's fear of your weaknesses. So I guess the way to optimize mastery is about building on your existing strengths. So you already know what your strengths are, and some examples are listed down below here. But it's also about overcoming your weaknesses. And we all have weaknesses, and that's fine. And there's some things you can be good at, and some things you're not necessarily good at, which is fine. You just got to acknowledge that. But sometimes there might be those weaknesses where you feel they are roadblocks from you progressing or growing in your life. And perhaps these are things that you can master. So for those particular things, it's important to try and step out of your comfort zone and actually learn something new so that you remove the issue as an obstacle. So for instance, one strength would be bravery or courage. But the weakness, the opposite of that, might be that you're a really shy person, or you hate networking, or you hate public speaking. And there are things to overcome that. So for instance, you can take a course in conversation taking, or just learn the skills in giving a talk. So that's one example of how you can, I guess, step out of your comfort zone to overcome that particular roadblock. I guess the most important thing to remember, though, is to be self-reliant. So many people seek relationships in order to find someone to complete them. So they outsource their happiness to either their partners or their children. But if that relationship happens to fail, or their children leave home, they completely fall apart. And that's because they don't have their own independent identity. They don't, I guess, seek happiness from themselves. They're outsourcing it to someone else. They're expecting someone else to fulfill them. But what you need to do is actually have your own interests, your own goals and sources of inspiration, so that you are completely independent and not codependent on someone else. Fourth one we have is positivity. So this is a nice, easy one. It's about optimism. It's about having a positive outlook. It's about remembering to smile, to laugh, and to be cheerful. So if you look at this image here, this is one of my favorite images because I think it's the epitome of joy. I mean, look at the camel's face, look at that child's face. It's just gorgeous. And I think sometimes we need to remember, particularly right now, to not take life too seriously and to just enjoy the simple things. And one thing we can do is think about all the things that we enjoy doing and actually schedule them into our diary like we do normal appointments or, tasks that we need to do. And one particular thing, I guess, to be mindful of is that we have this thing called, a phenomenon called the positive contagion effect. So, for example, if you happen to come across a funny video or a meme on Facebook, often what you want to do is share it with others, right? So the positive contagion effect, it's like a virus, but in a positive way. So it's something that can easily be spread. So laughter and joy is something that can be contagious and something that you can spread. And in some research, they've actually found that this particular effect actually promotes even more cooperation between people, and it promotes less conflict. So it might be something that you just might want to be mindful of. So, thinking about the people that you like to spend time with, are you actually more drawn to people who are more positive and joyful? And in a similar vein, how do you actually emanate to others? Is it your first instinct to actually smile to someone, to strangers, to your partner, to yourself, even in the mirror? I know that sounds kind of a funny question to ask, but for an activity, what you can do is actually try it for a week. Try smiling, and just try smiling more regularly or to different people, and see how it actually changes your perception of your environment and how people actually respond to you. So some other things that you can do to boost positivity, I guess schedule time for fun, to do positive to-do lists. And a couple of other less known ways are acts of kindness and positive reminiscence. And these are two other strategies that Miranda is going to elaborate on in her talk. Now, the fifth one is achievement. This is about basically identifying what drives you, your life purpose, what you're actually passionate about, what really excites you. These are the types of things that takes all your focus, and you forget about everything, you forget about the world, you forget about your phone, because you just focus on this particular thing because it brings you so much joy and a sense of achievement. So it's important to identify these kind of things in your life, and it doesn't have to be necessarily a work. It could be baking, could be singing, could be writing, but it's something meaningful to you. And it's important to set goals to actually complete these sort of things regularly in your life. Now, the last one is satisfaction with life. So this is just, your general overall satisfaction with your physical health. So remembering sleep, exercise, diet, remembering that social support is really important for your emotional well-being. So you might want to be a bit more mindful of, I guess, the company that you keep. Are your partners, are your friends, are your co-workers actually supporting your growth, or are they hindering it? Now, another technique to be, I guess, to be satisfied with our life is to be present, to use mindfulness. You've probably heard this term around a lot, but essentially what mindfulness is an easy way to remember it is to think of your five senses. So you've got sight, touch, taste, smell, and hearing. And what you need to do is draw your attention just to those senses when you're doing an activity. So you could do it while you're eating a meal, while you're walking, while you're breathing. And it's a great way to just bring yourself back to the present, so you're forgetting the past and you're forgetting the future. Another way, if you're particularly anxious or reactive, is to do some deep breathing for 5 minutes, where you can actually learn to count 3 counts in through your nose, the breath, 5 counts out through your mouth while saying the word relax. If you practice that for 5 minutes and you do that on a regular basis, eventually what your body will learn and your brain will learn is that once you say the word relax, your body will physiologically learn to relax automatically without you needing to do the breath work. So it's a great technique, particularly for public speaking. It's something I use, and it works. I seriously recommend it. Okay, and just to finish off, for those of you who are parents, you have children, and you might be still in isolation due to COVID, there's a few things that you can do with your kids to promote their well-being. The important thing is to have to enable them to have regular communication with their friends, their family, to validate how they're feeling at the time. You can do things such as journaling or writing, so they can do handwritten letters. They can plan future fun activities they like to do. You can do challenging group activities like family competitions. You can do parent parallel play, so you can play games on them, for instance, online with them, just to see the sort of environment that they're playing in, but you can also actually see some bullying online that's happening. But the other main, I guess, important thing to remember is children's, their brain development, their frontal brain development doesn't actually finish until their early 20s. So what that means is the frontal part of the brain actually helps you control your behavior and control your emotions. So children have all these emotions and they just don't know how to deal with it. They don't know how to express it, and it usually leads to some sort of tantrum. And I guess in those moments, it's really helpful to be mindful of, the stage of development that they're at, and maybe provide them healthy outlets to relieve that sort of tension and anger, such as a boxing bag. So, key takeouts to remember: we're not born resilient. Anyone can build it. The compass is a great tool you can use to both measure your well-being, but also the framework in building resilience in your own life. Increasing well-being can promote resilience to stress across children and adults alike. And I guess what I really hope that each of you can do today is just think about at least one new thing that you can implement today to promote your well-being. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'd like to acknowledge the whole team that's contributed to our work. And I just hope this has inspired each of you to do something different. Over to you, David.
Well, thanks, Justine. It's really great to learn about what we can all do to help increase our resilience and well-being. We're already getting a couple of questions for you, Justine, but before the question and answer, I wanted to quickly reintroduce Miranda Chilver, and she'll be discussing her latest research findings. Thanks for getting your presentation up, Miranda. Over to you.
Thank you, David, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining in today. As Justine said, I'm one of her PhD students, and I'm going to be talking about a trial that we've recently run in university students, looking at ways that they can improve their mental well-being. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the positive psychology interventions, what that means. Then I'm going to talk about, whether they work, what we found in my study, and how you can try them for yourself. Positive psychology interventions are activities that are evidence-based that you can use to help improve your mental well-being. These can include things ranging from mindfulness and meditation, yoga or other exercise, gratefulness or gratitude diaries where you write down what you're grateful for. But today I'm going to focus on 3 specific activities that I tested in my study, which was acts of kindness, positive reminiscence, and self-compassion. So to quickly give you some background on these 3 activities, first of all, acts of kindness is about doing kind acts for people in your life, exactly what it sounds like, but focusing on doing new things that you don't usually do. You should always reflect on the positive impact of these things when you've done it, so that you get a sense of accomplishment from completing it. Next is positive reminiscence, which is all about telling personal stories. Think about particularly meaningful events and things like overcoming challenging situations and people who've really influenced you or positive things that have affected who you are today. And then writing out or telling this story to someone else. Thirdly, self-compassion is about being kind and forgiving to yourself, the way that you would treat a friend, because we all know that it's common for people to treat themselves a lot worse than they would treat their friends. And it's a really great tool to use when you're feeling down about something specific in your life. So my study specifically looked at an intervention made up of these 3 activities: acts of kindness, positive reminiscence, and self-compassion. And we compared it against a control condition that did really similar activities, but missing what we think is the key component that makes them effective. So instead of doing acts of kindness, the control group did what I call acts of novelty. It keeps the aspect of the acts of kindness where you are doing new things that you wouldn't normally do, but it removes the part about being kind to other people, which means that they're not necessarily getting the same sense of community as the acts of kindness group. Then instead of positive reminiscence, the control group did a more neutral version of this task. So instead of being asked to talk about particularly meaningful experiences, we asked them to write about just more everyday experiences, such as something that they do as a hobby or something they remember from when they're a kid. Then finally, instead of self-compassion, the control group did self-esteem intervention. Now this can seem really similar to some people, but the difference between self-compassion and self-esteem is that self-compassion is more realistic in the way that it responds. It looks at the situation as a whole and tries to accept it as it is, whereas self-esteem is all about kind of pushing any negatives about an event to the bottom and focusing on all of the good things that help you feel better, but doesn't necessarily deal with the actual problem that caused you to feel bad in the first place. This study with these 2 groups was conducted in 326 university students with 163 per group. So quite a large study for this type. And participants did these activities over a period of 6 weeks. So they did each activity twice during the 6-week period. So what did we find? We found quite a consistent improvement in mental well-being in the intervention group, which is shown in blue, compared to the control group over the 6-week period. So you'll notice that at the start of the intervention, both groups were quite similar in their well-being and satisfaction, but over time, the intervention group kept increasing, whereas the control group didn't see that increased trajectory at all. So this shows that over time, with consistent practice, you can actually make a difference in your mental well-being by doing these positive psychology interventions. We also found that people with poor resiliency resources, meaning people who feel like they don't have the support networks that they need, can really benefit from this type of activity. So what we're looking at right now is depression, anxiety, and stress symptoms. And the blue line shows a much steeper decline in these symptoms compared to the control group. And this is specifically within people who don't feel like they have enough resources to help them through difficult times. These people also showed steeper increases in their mental well-being. So finally, I want to talk about how you can actually apply these tasks to your day-to-day life. First of all, acts of kindness is something that's best done in kind of bursts of activity. So the recommendation is to try and fit as many acts of kindness as you can in a short period, like 1 to 2 days. In my study, we use 5 to 10 acts of kindness, but it's great to challenge yourself to see how many you can fit in a short time frame. To start this off, you should consider the things that you already do to build people up in your life. We tend to do things that we don't strictly consider acts of kindness, but this can include anything from doing chores around the house to complimenting your friends to giving presents at Christmas and birthdays. So use these existing acts of kindness as a starting point. Then, once you've considered what you already do, think about how you can stretch yourself and expand your circle of kindness and try something new. An example could be that you already compliment your friends, but you don't necessarily compliment your coworkers or acquaintances that you meet. So during this acts of kindness activity, you can make a point to point out to people when they've done something really great or something nice that you can say. That said, you can also work with people who you're already kind to on a regular basis, such as your friends and family, and just try something new that you've never really done for them before that you think that they would appreciate. Or you can do things like community service, like cleaning up around your local area. Even though this isn't directed to a specific person, it can still have the same effects as other acts of kindness. Then finally, once you've completed this kind of intense 1 to 2 days of acts of kindness, reflect back on the impact that you've had, especially focusing on what you think had the biggest positive impact out of everything that you did. And this helps solidify that you can contribute to someone's life and make a difference. Second, I want to talk about positive reminiscence. This is something that you can spend a few minutes on, 5 to 10 minutes a week, and take the time to really reflect on it. And of course, you can spend longer than that if you're enjoying the activity. As I said before, it's all about retelling meaningful experiences. This can mean overcoming challenges, solving problems in your life. For instance, finishing a course that you didn't think you'd get to, or recovering from a relationship breakup, anything that felt like a really big challenge at the time, but you came through the other side of it and you feel good about it. So think of a difficult challenge, or you can think about meaningful moments that have affected who you are today, including people. So think of someone who's changed your life in a positive way and write about them. Then once you've chosen a specific example, take some time to either write or tell the story to someone from the beginning to the end. Where were you at the start? What happened? What experiences? How did you feel during the process? And how do you feel now having looked back on it? This can really help you solidify your experiences, reflect on positive moments, and just feel satisfied with yourself and your ability to overcome difficult challenges. Finally, I want to talk about self-compassion. This is something you can spend a few minutes doing anytime that you're feeling down on yourself. It's important that when you're doing this activity that you focus on one thing that is bugging you at the moment. So even if there is a lot of stuff going on, try to isolate one thing and focus on that for this activity. This could be something like you got in an argument and you realize you feel really bad about it. It could be losing your job or not getting a job that you really wanted, things that can really affect your self-worth. Then once you pick something, consider what you might say to a friend who is going through the same thing, because we tend to respond to our friends much more kindly than we talk to ourselves internally. And with that in mind of what you would say to someone else, write down or speak in a mirror or record yourself talking to yourself what you would say to give yourself some comfort and compassion. Importantly, there's 3 things to focus on when you're practicing self-compassion. These are focusing on kindness, being kind to yourself instead of judgmental. We would rarely judge our friends for one bad thing going on, whereas we often judge ourselves if there's one thing that goes wrong. So always reflect on being kind. Second, you should always focus on shared or global experiences rather than isolating experiences. You might feel like you're the worst person in the world or you really messed up and no one else would understand, but this is rarely the case. Everyone has challenges. Everyone has applied for a job that they wanted and they didn't get it. Lots of people have lost their jobs. You're not alone in your experience. There's nothing particularly wrong with you that puts you outside of everyone else. Then thirdly, focus on giving balanced responses rather than polarized responses. And this means taking the good and the bad together and giving a full perspective and not just focusing on the bad. That is all I have to say right now. I'm happy to answer questions in the question time, but I'd like to give a chance to our final speaker. So I'll pass back to David. And thank you so much for joining today.
Thanks so much, Miranda, for sharing such detailed information about your findings. What we might do now is throw it over to Braden, but I'm just looking at our time and I think we're going to run a bit over. So what we might do is, we really want to get to these question and answers. There've been quite a few questions coming through and we have been responding to some of those, but also I'll ask them so that we can hear directly from all of our panelists about those questions. So what we might do is we might go for a bit longer than finishing in 13 minutes. For those of you that can't stay the entire time, I do apologize, but what we will do is we'll have a recording of the video and we'll send the recording to all of you in case you can't stay. So I might throw to Braden now and then we'll extend the question and answer so that we can get to all of your questions. Thank you, Braden.
Yeah, thanks, David, and thanks to Justine and Miranda. I've sort of had a front row seat and learnt so much. I've been taking notes. I've been invited by the good folks at NeuRa just to share my story really briefly, and we'll emphasis on the briefly, I think, because those questions are really interesting. So yeah, my name is Braden. I live down here in sunny Gisborne in Victoria, in a small town about an hour north of Melbourne, and I live here with my family. That's the only photo I was allowed to use of them. This is what my work normally looks like. So I'm a youth worker in the Uniting Church. I travel all around Victoria and Tasmania supporting communities from diverse backgrounds and with an emphasis on young people and young adults. But unfortunately, and for so many of us, the last 6 months has looked more like this. Just Zoom meetings and emails from the comfort of my bedroom. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. In 2019, I participated in the Colour Your Hair campaign. I sort of moved from the sort of peacock multicolour look into the more refined and dignified, I think, pink galah mohawk. And what I found in that experience, we were able to raise some cash to fund what's going on at NeuRa, which is so important. But also, what was surprising was the amount of conversations that I got to have, whether it was at the school gate. In a small town, the pink sort of stood out. At the school gate with work colleagues, with family and friends, as I was sort of inviting people to support, I got to share why this was so important. And to do that, we got to head back to 2017, when somewhat out of the blue, I was diagnosed with a severe depression and anxiety. It hadn't been part of my experience before that, and I'm generally a pretty relaxed, outgoing guy. And so after some time and support from my family, I went and saw the medical health professionals, received the diagnosis, and began the therapy treatment. And oh man, I wish I'd listened to that last 45 minutes before then. But as I look back, some of the main things I struggled with are actually, how do I talk about this? How do I put aside shame, feelings of shame, of guilt, and actually begin to talk about this? How do I rebuild who I was, and not let this diagnosis define me, but actually realign who I was, building on what I'd learned and the new practices, the new skills I was required to develop. And a key thing that I learned, and that what was so helpful in the Color Your Hair experience, was the benefit of telling my story and of listening to other people's stories. As I got out and I spoke to people, at first one-on-one, was that so many people had some similar experience. And as we saw in Justine's chart, nearly a quarter of the population. And I found, as I shared my story, that helped them share theirs. And, particularly as I work with young people, more and more, they were able to find a conversation partner, not just me, but people in their family, people with their peers, gave them permission. It normalized it. It removed some of the unknowns and some of the taboo and stigmatized opinions. I hope that was certainly the aim. And now I find this image really helpful. Osher Gunsberg in his book talks about the spiraling nature of his mental health journey. So these days, with therapy and medication, I would say that it's fairly under control, but it gets a little meta, because now I get anxiety about getting anxiety, or I get depressed that I've got depression, and then I get depressed because I'm depressed about depression, and that sort of spiraling nature. So some of those really practical things are really helpful, and just simply communicating about it, continually talking to those people around me that understand where I'm coming from, that have some sense of shared experience. And I guess just to wrap up, what I found most helpful, in my work and family, is to allow myself to be a person first, to seek moments of joy, to enjoy life with people, and to let work always be secondary to that. To fully invest in work, whatever it is, but to actually realize that actually who I am and what I'm trying to do as myself is of primary importance, and allowing myself to take care of that. It dismisses those feelings of guilt and shame, and allows that capacity for flourishing that Justine talked about to be imagined. So yeah, thank you so much to NeuRa and the team for the invitation to share. I hope it's been helpful, and I think we'll hand back to David for the Q&A.
Thank you, Braden. We're really grateful for your openness in describing your experience, and NeuRa is really grateful that Braden is participating in our fundraising activity called Colour Your Hair for Mental Health. So yes, in a few weeks, he'll be colouring his hair, and the funds raised will support research like Dr. Gatt's work. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. There's been lots of questions coming through. So just a quick reminder to please use the question and answer button to submit your questions, and we'll do our best to get to them. We will extend our presentation by at least 15 minutes. And so we've got at least 20 minutes now of question and answers. And just to start, Justine, there has been a couple of questions just about how to build that resilience. And I was wondering if you could tie your research in with Braden's experience. So how, he mentioned that he would have loved to have heard that the last 45 minutes some time ago. How would that wellbeing scale, potentially have shaped his experience when he started experiencing those things in 2017 or even earlier?
Yes, I think, I guess the importance of this work is just to become for everyone to become a bit more self-aware of how they're actually coping. So even if you don't have technically a diagnosis of something, it doesn't mean you're doing well, you know, and there are things that you can do to just improve your situation. And a lot of it is just self-awareness. It's awareness of, you know, am I happy with my life? Am I coping effectively with stress? Can I deal with it better? You know, what are the kind of things that I can do quite easily now to prevent sort of burnout or burden, or protect myself with assertiveness, just so that, you know, I'm effectively coping, but also just enjoying my life. You know, you don't want to just have to struggle through day by day. I think you should at least enjoy the experience. So I think a lot of these things, I guess, we're trying to bring these tips to people because they're things that you can do. And yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Miranda, we have a question from Andrew, and he's asking about individuals versus, I guess, the interconnectedness of you know, our society. So his question is, you know, is there a responsibility for others to assist in all of our mental well-being? And given you know, your presentation touched on acts of kindness, I was curious about what you thought on this.
Yeah, I saw that question too, and it's a really good question because there's a lot of, you know, should I really be the person who has to take control of everything, or do the people around me have to help in our society? Does our society need to be built around mental well-being? And I definitely think that we can reach higher highs if we work together as a society, but in the meantime, we need to build ourselves up in our immediate relationships. And definitely the act of kindness is really about being kind to people around us, and this is often reciprocated. So even though if you're focusing on yourself, you can still influence other people to start taking similar actions. If you're telling a story about your life and your development, that can often inspire other people to share their positive reminiscence as well. And so everything is, Justine touched on this as well, as contagious when you are being positive and rubbing off on the people around you who start to pick up those habits. So this is just one approach that we can take to start building up from the bottom and hopefully build a more positive and connected society.
Brayden, I know that you work with some youth, and we've got a youth-related question, so I was interested in your perspective on this. But we've got a question from Fiona. I might throw it to you and then also to Justine. But the question is about, you know, what tips do you have to help youth, specifically who have mental health issues, start building resilience? And I guess what I'm wondering is, you know, did your own experience a couple of years ago shape how you, you know, chat to some of the, or interact with some of the youth that you work with?
Yeah, sure. And let me clarify, the other ladies are the experts here. But I think the conversation is the starting point. I really find that looking at mental health on a spectrum is a really useful approach, that how we feel and experience life at this moment doesn't define how we always do that. So it allows, you know, particular experiences and moments to be seen in a bigger context. And I think as well, helping young people find those people that they can talk to about it, whether they be in their immediate family or in their peer network, or the you know, the great amount of online resources as well, that can actually help them start that conversation, develop some language around it, and begin to articulate it, and then access resources they need as appropriate. I think it's around giving them permission to talk about it, I think, is, from a community perspective, is the most helpful first step. Yeah.
Justine, I just wanted to, you know, extend Brayden's point just there about talking and discussion, and bring in another question. We've got this question from Kiriti, and it's to do with different cultures. And I know, Justine, you've done a study on youth and youth of different cultural backgrounds. So I was interested in your thoughts about, you know, youth and resilience, but also the way in which different cultures might communicate around mental health matters.
Yes, so we, I haven't mentioned it today, but we did run a study across 6 countries. We're looking at well-being in youth. They range from, I think, 12 up to about 16 years. And so they came from Sydney, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, China, and the UK. And we essentially wanted to compare well-being across all of these different cultures to see how they compared. And we found them all to be pretty much very similar, surprisingly. And the scale was even reliable in all of the cultures. So we're able to measure, I guess, well-being across different cultures. And the tips, while some of the tips, yes, they might be more, I guess, suitable to some more Western cultures, particularly, you know, for instance, assertiveness. There are other things that I think could be used across any culture, and well, an interesting study would be to see how we can tailor these tips to be, I guess, cross-cultural. So that's a good question to ask. Thank you.
We've had a couple of questions that I think just build on what Justine just said, and Miranda, I might throw them to you. It's really around these results and how they impact people across different ages. You know, so I know, you know, with your study being all university students, you know, how representative is that to people who are younger, who are older?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point, because a lot of the past research that's looked at positive reminiscence has predominantly been in elderly samples, and mine is among the first that's actually looked at younger participants. And acts of kindness and self-compassion have also been assessed in a range of age groups. I'm not sure so much about in children, but definitely across the adult lifespan, a lot of this research has been done. And my study specifically compared against the active control, which most of these past studies did a weightless control, meaning that the control group isn't doing anything. So my research contributed in that way, but also a lot of the research that's been done before mine has looked at general community samples or elderly samples. So from what I've seen, it does generalize, not just based on my study, which is limited to that kind of young adult age group. I think my average age was 19. But looking at the research as a whole, it is quite convincing that it's not specific to a certain age range. However, the way that you do this with children would probably have to be adapted to make it appropriate for their level.
I could add a bit to that if you like.
Yeah, of course, Justine.
I didn't present it today, but we looked at, for instance, gender and age differences in our twins. So in terms of well-being, so the twins, they range in age from 18 to 60. And we looked at male-female differences in well-being, and we actually found no difference. So men and women show very similar levels of well-being. But in terms of age, there is a pattern. So we found kind of like a graph where from 18, it's kind of the, well, lowest point on this in terms of age, not necessarily low well-being, but in terms of the other age groups, and it increased up to about the 40 to 50-year-old range, where it kind of plateaued a bit, which I like to call the midlife crisis, and then it went actually quite up higher again when you get older. So it's kind of a trend of actually, as you age, your well-being increases. And I don't know if that's because, I guess, you really know who you are as a person, or you don't really care about those little, you know, the things that kind of matter to you when you're a bit younger. But yeah, that's kind of the trend.
So we've got a couple of questions about the actual kind of well-being chart, but just before we go to that, we might stay with this theme of how you know, how mental illness affects different people, different kind of I guess, groups of people, because we have one, and I might throw to you, Braden, and then to the researchers, but just it's about gender. You know, Braden, I was wondering, in your experience, you know, you mentioned discussing your experience with people around you. Did you notice, you know, it was there a gender dimension to some of the discussions that you were having?
Oh, I think, you know, there would probably be a strong argument to say that men stereotypically don't talk about this stuff as well as women. Again, I'm not the scientist, and you know, we can tap into this warped sense of, you know, what it means to be a man and that sort of stuff. But certainly at the school gate, there were lots of mums that wanted to ask about the hair. But I think the younger you are, certainly in, you know, my work with high schoolers and stuff, I don't see that as represented. I think everyone's up for the conversation, and maybe that's more in, you know, that sort of toxic masculine sort of idea is entrenched as you get older. I'm not qualified to guess on that, but yeah, I think people were shocked that I was willing to be so open about it. Certainly, sometimes it caught them off guard. But yeah, I think I think there's some good work out there now encouraging all people to talk about this and to you know, normalize it as best we can.
Miranda, was there, you know, did you look at gender in your study, and what were some of the findings that you had?
Yeah, actually, I did check for an interaction with gender in my results, and I didn't find anything either. So some reasons for that could be just in the sample that I used, it was mostly females. Females tend to sign up more, and there's more females studying psychology, which is the class I looked at. But there's still plenty of male participants in the study, and I didn't see any moderation of gender on whether the intervention worked. There were some general associations with gender just at their baseline starting level. For instance, females did have higher depression, and the way that they responded to stress over the course of the study was a little bit different, with, I believe it was men kind of increasing in stress more than females, but the females started out higher, so that could be why. But in terms of whether they responded positively to the intervention, it didn't seem to have anything to do with it. So it would be effective regardless of your gender.
Justine, we have a question from Peter, and I'll just explain, you know, I'll just read the question as it is. You know, he's saying, how important is it that better thinking and behaviour strategies are implemented early when somebody maybe realises that they're not well? Like, do the bad thinking patterns become habitual quickly? What would you say in response to that?
Well, I guess, yeah, as soon as you realize, you know, that you're using those kind of cognitive patterns, the better. And I guess if you keep repeating the same kind of habit, yeah, it gets a bit more difficult to change, but it doesn't mean you can't change it. So I think, I mean, first step is to be aware that you're actually doing that. If you're even aware that you're doing that, number one, that's the biggest hurdle. And then it's just knowing how to change it, because a lot of people are not even aware of, you know, how they're thinking about things, how they're reacting to people differently, what's triggering them, you know, and they're just sort of going through life in their kind of autopilot mode. So if you're even just self-aware, if you're even, yeah, mindful of those kind of patterns, that's like a huge hurdle, I think.
Justine, I might stay with you. You know, of those 6 steps in your, or those 6 elements within your wellbeing scale, is there one that's more important than any of the others?
I think they're all related. So if you improve one, it probably improves the others. I think at the core of it, I think most of us are probably challenged by our own worth, our self-worth, purely because we are impacted by how our parents treat us, how our friends, how our partners treat us, how our boss treats us. you know, you get that negative feedback over time, you start to believe it. And, you know, when you don't have a good sense of self-worth, then you let people treat you as they will. And then that doesn't help your mastery or self-confidence. It doesn't help your positivity. It doesn't help how you deal with stress. It's just like a domino effect. So I think if you can actually, if you want to target one particular thing, if you can start with your own worth and focus on building that, then everything else just sort of, it comes easier. So that's personally my, that's the thing I would target.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, Justine, because actually most of what we're getting through in the question and answer are comments rather than questions, and they're really comments directed to Braden, thanking him for sharing his story. And so I guess I was wondering, Braden, you know, given what Miranda and Justine have been discussing today, whether there were any takeaways, you know, for you about how you might think about things going forward. And I'm definitely putting you on the spot, so no worries if there isn't anything.
No, no, like I meant, like, I think seeing that the compass was really helpful in terms of, you know, and I'm not surprised that Justine would say that they do influence each other, you know, so and finding the really simple ways to get going on that. I think as well that positive self-reminiscence is something that that I learned today, and the self-empathy I've come across before, and I find that really helpful. You know, give ourselves a break, sort of thing. Allow ourselves to catch our breath and be human. And yeah, and you know, mine isn't particularly unique, and it's not particularly special or particularly severe. I've just had, I guess, by the nature of my role, I've had the opportunity to talk to people, and again, that's what I found allows me to overcome, you know, experience, like moments where depression or anxiety becomes overwhelming, is that I almost try and talk my way out of it, and I hopefully, you know, encourage other people to get to use those tools as well. But I'm certainly going to steal the stuff we heard today. Don't worry about that, and start, you know, helping people, because, you know, resilience is a bit of a buzzword. What does it mean? Well, I think we've heard pretty clearly that there's some good science behind it and some real practical applications. So.
Well, thanks again, Braden. So I did say at the beginning that or kind of midway through, that we might extend our Q&A. So I think we're at the end of our extended time. We'll have one more question. Thank you to all of our participants who have stayed with us for the extra time. I might direct this one to Justine. And the question is, you know, how valuable and useful would this information be for workplaces, schools, and university students, and how would they obtain information about your findings?
I think this information, it applies to anyone, and it's my life purpose to get it out to as many people as possible. And we're actually, to help everyone, what we're actually doing is we're building a Wellbeing app that will be available hopefully early next year. And it will include the compass scale, so you can actually get a score on it. And then we have all these activities that we've talked about today, as much as we could possibly fit in an app, built into it. So recommend the kind of things that you can do. It gives you a bit of guidance, you know, as to how you can do it. You can have a little goal setting section, all those kind of things. And I'm hoping that once that's available, we can just get it out to anyone who needs it.
Well, thank you so much, Justine, Miranda, Braden, for your time and for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. Thank you to everybody who joined us today, especially those of you who asked questions. I do apologise, we weren't able to get to a couple of the questions at the end, but we hope that you learned something new. And if you'd like to know more about our mental health research or support our work, you'll see on your screen, please head over to the Colour Your Hair for Mental Health website. For those of you who attended the webinar, we'll also send you some information on this campaign, as well as some info on Justine's work, and you'll have a link to the webinar also in case you'd like to share it with someone that you know. So all of our contact information will be in the email. We're keen to hear from you, so please don't hesitate to contact us if you'd like more information. So thanks again, and goodbye for now.